we've been in a recession since 2008. The only reason it's looked positive, even under Obama, is because their governments have been running huge deficits. In the UK, in 2010, the Chancellor, who was the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury, he said that the budget would be balanced by 2015. Now, the Chancellor now is saying that we'll probably be running deficits until 2025. So what concerns me is that the general public doesn't know about this, that it's going to be, things are going to get bad.
SDBullion.com is a high-volume physical gold, silver, and precious metal dealer. We are committed to being your trusted source for low-cost, highest quality investment-grade bullion products. Visit SDBullion.com for more information.
Welcome to another Silver Doctors exclusive. Today I'm excited to have first-time guest, Mr. Mario Necco. He's a former broker as well as a YouTube commentator, and today he's joining us to share his thoughts on the global economy as well as the financial markets. So Mario, welcome to Silver Doctors.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, I appreciate you taking time to sit down with me and to share your thoughts. And so for those that may not know, you are also on YouTube at Manico64. So I'm glad to have a chance to sit down with you to get your thoughts on a variety of subject matter. But before we dive into that, for those that may not know who Mario Necco is, can you share with us a little bit of your background and how you've arrived to this point now in your career?
Yeah, I started out in finance after university in Switzerland. I got a job at a small private bank in Geneva for 2 years. Portfolio management. I did a lot of work in the back office, starting from the bottom. And then I was asked by a friend who was in London starting up like a brokerage desk at Cantor Fitzgerald to work with him, broking treasury bonds, cash. So I came to London, and from there I moved eventually into futures and options broking, exchange traded derivatives. I worked for major banks, brokerage houses for up until 2012. And then I left the city, started my YouTube channel late 2015. I wanted to talk about the markets, how I used to talk with my institutional clients. My clients weren't private clients. They were like bankers, fund managers, corporate treasury managers. And I wanted to talk to the general public and inform them of how the markets work and what I thought of the monetary system. That's one of the objectives of my channel as well, because I got into precious metals in 2002 while I was still in the city. And when you get into precious metals, you start looking at money and the history of money, something that I wasn't taught at university before. And it opened a can of worms for me. And I was, even in the city, I warned people even before '08 about the system. And a lot of my friends that are still in the city, they're still holding a lot of precious metals as well. And they got in because of me. So that's why I started my channel, to inform the public of how fragile, and basically a Ponzi scheme our monetary system is, because it doesn't have an anchor. It's not based on real value. It's just created out of thin air. So that's my background.
Right, understandable. So thank you for sharing that with us. And so I'm curious to find out, we're beyond the halfway point of 2019, and there's a lot of things going on. And so you're currently in the UK, so we're definitely going to touch on the recent Boris Johnson being elected as prime minister there. Before we get into that, I'm curious to find out, what are some things that really concerns Mario at this point, halfway through the year, with a lot of things that's happening globally? What are some things you're keeping an eye on the most?
Well, it's not that it concerns me, because I've always thought that it would happen, but until it happens, you're not really sure. When they started out with QE, zero interest rates, back in '08, '09, I knew it would. They would never be able to get out of it, because I've studied a lot of history, monetary history, One of the books that I read was Fiat Money, Inflation in France. And they tried that in 1790s, post-revolutionary France, to issue paper money to kickstart the economy. They had the same problem. France had loads of debt. The economy was weak. And they found out that after an issue of paper money, things improved. But eventually, the effect would dwindle, and they had to issue even more. They had to keep issuing, and it came to a point where the whole thing imploded. And that's why, and that's what concerns me, because now we can see the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England probably as well. They're all going back to cutting rates, printing more money. The Fed tried to normalize things, but they couldn't do it. Janet Yellen said a year and a half or two ago that unwinding the balance sheet would be like watching paint dry. But we saw what happened at the end of last year with the stock market, and they had to quickly stop that. I think they're still doing the QT, but they're going to stop soon in September. And I suspect that they're going to start doing more QE eventually.
Right.
They are expected to cut rates on Wednesday, the Fed, by 25 basis points. I think there's more
so
than
you're thinking that they're
80%
going to
chance.
cut by a quarter of a point this upcoming
Yeah,
week?
there's more than 80% the market is pricing in, so I think they'll definitely do it. So that's what concerns me, that the things are really, they're going to really inflate again the currencies. The other thing that I've noticed is that the fiscal side as well, they're going to inflate that as well. Governments are going to spend. You saw the U.S., they approved to raise the debt ceiling. They didn't even have a fight. You'd think Trump would have a really tough time with Pelosi, but they agreed on it.
Yeah.
In the UK, the new government prime minister, they're talking about increasing spending, even though the UK, the UK has a lot of debt, and the pound continues to drop. Inflation here is running more like 3 or 4%, and we've got interest rates at the base rate, Bank of England, at 0.75%. So savers are being punished. The pound, we're almost, if we manage to close where we are, 1,146 in sterling, the price of gold at the end of the month, it will be the highest closing level ever. Even in 2011, it didn't close that high.
Now, that's interesting. That's interesting that the nominal price, fiat price of gold, pretty much globally, except here in the U.S., has returned or exceeded all-time highs. But yet, you know, here in America, for the most part, we don't really hear much about how important gold is from the mainstream, even though more people are coming around to it. But it's more so from the alternative media, where gold is becoming more of a major factor in a lot of people's psyche these days is money.
Yeah, but here in the UK as well, not many people look into gold either. It's like in the US, it's just us and the alternative. But I think the US price will catch up. I guess, the US is the least ugly of the currencies because it's the reserve currency.
Yeah. Now, when you say catch up, will it reach the previous high of 19, or will it exceed that by far?
I think it will. It will exceed that, because I think the fact that we broke through 1375 is a big thing. And we've retested it a few weeks ago to 1381, I think. But I think, and you look at all the price of gold in other currencies like the Aussie dollar, Canadian, they're all breaking out.
Yeah. Now you touched about what concerns you is the quantitative easing aspect, and so over here the narrative is still that we're at an economic expansion. They're still using the words expansion amongst it to make all these monetary policy type of cuts here. And so I'm not sure over in your area, are they still the narrative primarily is an expansion, or is it a lot different over there?
Well, I think the U.S. is like some people, when I say this, they say, "Oh, you're anti-Trump," but I'm just looking at the numbers. The U.S. is running a 5% budget deficit in the supposedly great economy. And so that means that if it wasn't for the government overspending, if you take that 5% off of GDP that the government is overspending, the GDP would be negative. If you just look at private sector, here in Europe and in the UK, the deficits, we have a deficit here, I think is 1.6%. So we're not spending as much as the US. And if you look at Germany, people say, oh, the Germany economy is doing well, not doing well, but they're growing at 1.6%, and they run a budget surplus. So,
Yeah.
And the other thing, the stock market in the US is looking good, but it's mostly because of buybacks. Corporations are still doing buybacks. And how do they do buybacks? Well, they issue bonds, they just borrow money for nothing. And I think also, if the Fed hadn't backtracked and continued raising rates, I mean, Goldman Sachs towards the end of last year was still seeing 3 rate hikes this year. And the excuse, of course, is the trade dispute.
Yeah.
I think that's just a scapegoat, in my opinion.
Yeah, I do agree. Now, as a response to all this policy that's coming back into play again, and so basically quantitative easing as well as some more government expenditures will be added to the balance sheet because of a lack of budget. So I imagine that, are those true signs of a recession? Like, where is the recession narrative? Are we currently in one? Because more and more indicators are red. What are your thoughts?
I think we've been in a recession since 2008. The only reason it's looked positive, even under Obama, is because their governments have been running huge deficits. In the UK, in 2010, the Chancellor, who was the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury, he said that the budget would be balanced by 2015. Now, the Chancellor now is saying that we'll probably be running deficits until 2025. So what concerns me is that the general public doesn't know about this, that things are going to get bad. Of course, they're going to tell us there's no inflation, but we all know that the cost of living is rising. It's going to get even worse, especially in the UK and Europe, I think, because they're going to keep printing. Government is going to keep spending. And all that government spending does, in my opinion, as a proponent of small government, is that it crowds out the private sector, which really creates the wealth for the economy. So it's not going to help. And the central bank money printing or creation of credit out of thin air, that's not going to help either.
Right. Now, what are your thoughts on, like, from prior experience, being able to look back over the last decade of this new unprecedented monetary policy, which is now going to become common policy as far as easing, the asset bubbles, housing, stock market, student debt. I mean, a lot of things have been overly inflated and the valuations are completely off. Do you see this next round of easing as a way of keeping those asset bubbles inflated, or will they go into other sectors or other areas to try to balance it?
No, I think it's they're just trying to keep it all inflated, all these assets. Maybe it looks like now also the precious metals are going to be inflated, because I think more and more people are going to realize that there's no way out for the central banks, that they're going to have to QE to infinity. I think up until recently, they were just giving them the benefit of the doubt that they're going to be able to put rates back up to 5% or so, unwind the balance sheet. But can you imagine the ECB trying to raise rates to like 2%? I mean, now their base rate is negative. The Fed tried, and they had to stop very quickly, or else they were going to bring the whole house of cards down.
Right. Now, I know in the European area, especially the negative yielding bonds, I'm hearing more about all-time highs. And so clearly, I guess that they're going to continue to purchase all types of assets. And so can you see one day where they'd get directly into the equities markets or whatever else what other assets can they monetize or buy to up, in your opinion?
I saw an editorial last week or the week before in the FT by an analyst from BlackRock, and he was telling the ECB they should start thinking about buying stocks to help companies in Europe. I guess that would help BlackRock, wouldn't it?
Yeah, big time.
But that doesn't, central bank creating credit out of nothing to buy stocks doesn't create wealth, you see. But they probably will. And I think what creates what I think needs to happen, and it could happen not out of choice, is for everything to implode and things to start again. It's like a forest. Sometimes a forest fire is a good thing. The forest grows better after there's a fire. But they just ever since '08, they won't allow things to correct anymore. They can't do that forever. And when it does correct, it's going to be horrific, in my opinion. Not sure how, but it won't be pretty.
Right, I agree. I was just not long ago watching or reading some information here, because currently in the U.S. and I've read things about things happening in the U.K. as well, but the whole pension system, I saw an article saying that there is no crisis, but then again we have political figures here, especially some representatives from Michigan, talking about the multi-employer pension system and how it's imploding. And I think 1.3 million people out of 10 million currently invested in the Teamsters union here they run the risk of being having their benefits slashed. And so here we have the whole idea of lending money to the pension plan systems with their inability to be able to repay. And so if they can't repay, they'll just forgive the debt in 30 years or something like that. So the pension system. So I'm not quite sure how that will all play out, because it's definitely going to be painful for those people who are expecting to receive payouts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not a specialist, but when I took a private pension in the 90s, the financial advisor said, well, we calculate that when you retire, you're going to have so much, and you're going to have an 8% income. So they base all these pensions on an 8% yield in a world where interest rates are negative or zero. So that's the problem. And a lot of these pensions you saw here in the UK from a local council, they put money with riskier investments, Woodford, and now their money's been frozen.
Yeah.
So they can't provide a return for their the retired the pensioners, because 15, 20 years ago, you could take the pension pot and put it into 5-year or 7-year treasuries and get 5-6%. Yeah. So, but now you can't, you get less than 2%. That's the problem with the pensions. And the other thing I heard is that they could confiscate pensions as well. Instead of confiscating gold, they could just say, we're going to lock your pension, but we're going to give you treasuries, you see.
So how are those treasuries? So how will they pay out?
It's like they did in Poland, U.S. treasuries. So I've heard that as well, but that's something else. But yeah, pensions is a problem because the central bankers are continuing to manipulate interest rates to zero. The thing is, in an ideal world, you would let interest rates rise to the market level like Paul Volcker did, and rates went to 20%. But if they did that now, there's so much debt that the whole system would implode. All the markets would implode, asset markets, and all the pensions would become worthless as well. So it's a rock in a hard place. It's not pretty. The thing for pensions is not to depend on them. I think people are just going to have to come to the realization that you're going to have to work a very long time if you want to have a decent standard of living.
Right, I do agree. Now let's touch on a little bit what's happening in the UK with the Prime Minister situation, and I'm hearing a lot, and so we don't get much of the other side of the coin here from on this side of the waters here. But what's the sentiment like in the streets there amongst your fellow Brits there? Are they excited? Are they looking forward to the Brexit? Will he live up to his promises? Or give us some thoughts on what's happening there.
Well, here it's a lot like the U.S. that there's a lot of division. Half the country, or just less than half the country, wants to stay in the EU, and they hate Boris, and the other half love him, and they think he's going to get the country out even without a deal. So that's, and I think the EU, they are not willing to renegotiate with Boris. So it's going to be, I think we could see the UK leaving without a deal on October 31st. So
how would that? What will be some of the side effects from that? Like, what would you expect to happen right away, or anything?
Well, you see the establishment and the Remoaners, they call them, because the Remainers, they're moaners, they call them Remoaners. They're scaremongering, saying the world will end if we leave without a deal. Yeah, it will be uncertain. It will, but I think we need to get out. And this is not speaking from being biased or anything. I think it's just a matter of, because there was a referendum, 52% of the population voted to leave, and they won. So that's how a referendum works. So if they delay it again, it could be just as bad. So again, between a rock and a hard place, whatever happens. But as I tell my viewers a lot, and I've been saying this since before the referendum in 2016, the establishment, the bankers, they're going to use the Brexit as a scapegoat. I think if we weren't even going through this process of Brexit, we'd still be in dire straits economically. The pound would still be dropping because we've got so much debt, and the only way to pay off that debt is to destroy the currency, basically, because the debt is the currency. So if you make it worth less, it's easier to carry it. So whatever happens, the pound, like all the other fiat currencies, is going to keep sinking, in my opinion.
Yeah. Wow. And so I like how you keep hinting on we're at a rock and a hard place where there's no way of escaping this mess.
No, there isn't.
Yeah. So my thing is, if every central bank now is pretty much up against their own policies, so I guess we've reached the end game of the debt-based monetary system. And so, in your opinion, what are some things that might be thrown out there? I mean, we have Jim Records, who's out doing a tour on his new book, and he used to be an SDR guy, so I'm not sure what he's talking about now. But what are some things that you think they have prepared or going to issue the world? Because if confidence in currencies are lost, then what?
Well, I don't think they think that the establishment, the central bankers, they believe in their hubris. So they think they're just going to keep printing more, and they're going to. IMF is encouraging countries to spend more as well, fiscal. So they're just going to keep doing it. More money printing, more government spending. So yeah, the only way to protect yourself is try to keep your job. Yeah. Try to save, not in paper, but in precious metals, even a little bit of cryptocurrency. Yeah. Pay off your debt. Don't play their game. Try not to borrow and spend too much. Of course, you have to spend, but you have to produce as well. But don't spend money that you don't have. That's because it's not going to get. I think the system, they don't have anything up their sleeves. I think they're going to try to keep a whole control of the system, and they can only do that through more. That's the only tool they have: more money printing and more spending for governments.
Right. Now, and so no doubt that other central banks, the smaller central banks, will utilize monetary policy to basically inflate away their own currencies, where therefore a lot of people might run to the current reserve currency, the Federal Reserve note. But if the central bank here is doing the same thing, they're going to be looking for options. And so I assume that plays into all the initial setup of that One Belt, One Road, and what China and Russia, how they've become extremely close over the last decade plus. And so do you foresee, and of course this is all opinion based, do you see the rollout of some type of new plan that's been presented from the Eastern, nations as far as that next leadership role in the monetary system?
I think they're just trying to cooperate between each other, amongst each other, like China and Russia, and also other non-aligned nations, as they call it, Venezuela, Iran, and other countries. They might come out with the system, but I think it's more informal. I think for the world, it would need to be the US, Europe, and China. They need to sit down and work things out again, some kind of Bretton Woods, because we haven't had a system since 1973. 71, Nixon closed the gold window. In 73, we went into floating exchange rate. So we haven't had a real monetary system since then for the world. But yeah, those countries are going to try to deal, let's say China and Vietnam, they're going to try to deal with each other and their currencies more and more. But I think they need to have gold because, will the Chinese trust, let's say, the Vietnamese currency if they have no gold? Probably not. So yeah, gold will be probably an informal, important part of this. It's more like a bilateral system, like each country dealing with each other. And why use the dollar if Russia is selling oil to, South Korea? Why use the dollar? They can use their own currency. Right. But they'll need to have a gold base. And that's why they're buying so much gold. Yeah. In the East.
Seems like everyone, I'm watching as all these other nations, I hear about more and more stories about nations repatriating their gold from the U.S. as well as accumulating. And there's more stories now about people accumulating and getting their weight up physically, while here in the U.S., gold is not even mentioned. And then we had President Trump tweet about how strong I think he said the U.S. dollar in reference to the whole
United States dollar. He said, isn't it? It's going to be strong. It's the best currency. Going to be the best currency forever. Almost, he said something like that.
Right, and it's interesting how prior to him becoming president, I saw several videos and commentary from him talking about the importance of gold and how the dollar is not something that you probably want to hold on to. So it's interesting how prior to being president, you could speak one way, but when you're president, you have to play that same narrative of keeping confidence in the system. So as far as last question, then I'll let you go. I appreciate you taking time for me. The presidential cycle in the U.S. is underway now, so I guess Trump will run for a second term. And so there's all types of riffraff here in the U.S. because the Democratic side is offering a lot of free stuff, for debt forgiveness, student loan, you name it. What are your thoughts looking from the UK to the US about this current political cycle, and is it important in your opinion?
Well, you said Democrats are all spending that forgiveness, but the Republicans, they're just the same team, but a little different. They do all the spending, but it's more like for the corporations and the warfare state. Right. And it's the same thing here in the UK, left and right. It's just a way to keep people divided and keep spending. So, yeah, I think Trump is going to win. But the left, that's the problem. We've had the bankers and the big corporations been bailed out 11 years ago. And it's not surprising now that the left want the people to be bailed out. So forgiving student debt is no different than the government bailing out AIG or Citibank or Citigroup in 2008. It's just so that's the problem. You help the 1%. Now the 99% wants help, and you can understand that, even though I don't agree with both. Right. So for me, it's going to continue more and more debt. That's the only thing that I can see from the politics. No matter who gets elected, we're going to have more and more debt.
Right. Well, Mario Onneko, it's been great having you join us here on Silver Doctors. For those that may not know, Mario, can you give them a little insight as to how to follow you and stay in tune with what some of your commentary work?
Yeah, I make a video virtually every day on YouTube. The channel is Maneco64. That's how you can follow me.
Sounds good. Well, once again, Mario, it's been great having you here on Silver Doctors. Looking forward to continue to stay in tune with what you have going on, as well as having you on in the future and getting your thoughts as things unwind. And definitely in the fall, curious to find out how this whole Brexit situation works out. So thanks again for joining us here on Silver Doctors.
Oh, you're welcome, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Take care.